just listened to was a story about the lady that when the team was done, she had 4 options. She had at least 4 options. That probably wasn't the limit, but there was 4 identified. And that's something I think the hope we can see in the farming picture is we got to identify more options. What's worked in the past is not going to work in the future. That's obvious. We've got to figure out where to go. I think there's points. You know, this soil health as it ties to farm profitability is one of the things that we've got to do, because particularly in production agriculture, staying out of the niche type things, production agriculture is the profitability is going to be on lower margins than what it has been in history. Particularly with New York upstate, New York competing with the Midwest more directly on many things. There are some areas of the country that just have some production advantages over us, whether it's weather, whether it's...
saw the soils map.
Right.
That showed us the soils.
Yeah, it's all different. But if we can get to the point of soil health like I'm talking about, we have a lot more chance to produce what we need to produce to pay the bills at a lower cost. But we have to get there first, and we have to stay alive while we're getting there. The other point is some of us have the option or opportunity to get into more of a niche thing to increase the income side of the equation. But I will tell you on this that all of your niche, or most of them at least, most of your niche opportunities are going to come from a standpoint of a perceived healthier farm. And the perception needs to be the reality, or it's not going to last in the long term. There are testing tools that are being developed right now. I don't know when they will be available. The technology already exists. It's just a matter of people putting things together and making it available. But there are testing tools that are being developed that will be able to scan fruits and vegetables and maybe even some other types of grocery store items and identify not only pesticide residues, which is typically not such a big thing, but the nutrient concentration of what they're getting. When that becomes widely available, it's going to change the game of agriculture in general. You're not going to be able to hide behind a marketing plan when the consumer can test what your end product is. So think about the options, and there's ways of going forward. We just need to do it. And how can we get there quicker?
Is that a silver bullet? Getting there quicker? You're going to give us one, right?
No.
Okay.
I'm afraid not. Actually, there are silver bullets, but you got to have a belt full of them. That's not just one. So a quick review of kind of what I covered this morning. To me, I think this is the optimal agriculture in terms of where most agriculture needs to be trying to go, is with perennials, a more forage-based, grass-based livestock agriculture, and we eat more than meat and milk, so this doesn't cover everything, but this is where a lot of it can go. And this is where the Northeast has an advantage over lots of areas in the rest of the country. We can grow some really great forage. We need to make the most of that opportunity. Well, what if we need to grow some food grade grain, some chicken feed, some hog feed, some cow feed in the interim until we get our fat levels up? We have to work with this type of crop as well. And the profitability on this type of crop comes down to how much of that is growing, how much of that carbon going into this crop is coming from a healthy soil system versus how much of it is being put into the crop through the inputs we have to purchase. And there can be a huge variation there. On plowing down a sod field on this particular crop of corn that was yielding almost 200 bushels per acre, a certified organic farm. It was a plowed down sod field. It was a really biologically alive soil, and that's very doable. But it's a little hard to do that year after year. Plowing down a sod gives you a 1-year jump nutrient-wise, and to do a full-length crop like this, this harvest is taking place the end of October, probably into November. I'm not sure what the date was here. But there's no opportunity anymore for establishing a cover crop at this point. So it's got to fit into a rotation. It's not something we can do back to back every year and make progress. Or maybe fruits and veggies are what you're after. And I do know that this is the one bright spot in the agricultural world. This is one point where you will get paid for quality, and the dollars per acre are still substantial, much better than the milk market. But it's a complete different game, and it's not for everybody. But here, the same type of soil that will produce those kind of forages will produce fruits and vegetables with very little input needs in terms of crop protectants. There'll be very little insect pressure, little or no disease pressure. You know, these are photos from organic farms that were not using any pesticides, not even organic approved ones. And that's where, you know, they were achieving the results. In fact, to go back a little bit, there's a bit of a story connected with, I said earlier that I had heard of several farms where they hit 6, 7, 8% fat content in their forage, but I was never able to visit any of them. It was just, I heard people talk about, you know, they'd been on them a few years back. What every one of those farms did, and they were all relatively small scale farms in Amish communities, is the ones I knew about. Every one of the farmers that hit that with their dairy sold the dairy cows and went to growing produce. The same thing happened over here in Rod's neighbor in Finger Lakes region. In 2016, we saw 6% fat content in his pastures. He was milking 65 pounds with very little grain input. And he was also a produce grower, small scale. He had a tomato greenhouse and did a little bit of outdoor production, not much. But he really liked his tomato greenhouse, and he was doing a really good job with that as well. One day, at that point, it was the spring of 2016, he was like, he was talking to me one day, and he was like, why is it that, you know, we can't go to these farms that have gotten these great fats in their forages? You know, what's the deal with that? And I laughed and I said, what the deal is exactly what you're going to do too. So in a couple of years, you're going to sell your cows and go to growing produce. And that's exactly what happened. But in this case, he sold it to his younger brother and moved to a different farm to grow his produce, so we still have that farm to work with. Hopefully we'll be able to keep it going. But there is a lot of opportunity there. And with these goals, how do we get there? Well, here's where you may want to take some notes in this section, because I'm going to give you some actual numbers and things that you can take home and use yourself. This is a soil test off of a second farm my dad bought. It's actually a good quality soil, but it's a light soil. It's a river bottom soil that's relatively light, and it was not in good condition biologically or minerally. These samples were taken off of an old horse farm where they did nothing but make hay off these fields for the past 30 years. They were really impressed with, the owner was really impressed with the hay production, or at least the hired man that lived there next door was, until I got up in the loft of the barn and started checking out the bales and realized that their average bale weight was about 25 pounds. So then it was no longer quite so impressive. But at any rate, it's a soil that's been mined. The perennial grass growing out there was actually really low productivity. And what we have, I point out some things. It was a lower pH. I don't know if you can really read this, but yeah, I was afraid the print would be too small. But we've got pHs of in the 5s mostly. It ranges from 6.2 to 5.8. And actually 6.2 to 5.6, there's a 5.8 in the middle. We got good organic matter as a percentage, but I know from the way the crops were growing that the particulate organic matter was almost non-existent in these soils. We're low in almost all the minerals. We're low in sulfur, low in phosphorus, low in calcium. I mean, go down the whole list and there's nothing showing up high anywhere. except, well, even the aluminum, surprisingly for the low pH, is not excessively high. But these are soils that are relatively dead and low nutrient, except for the excellent organic matter.
Which is what?
Yeah, it's got great organic matter in this lower lying soils. So what that means is all I need to do is activate that organic matter and this whole picture changes. I got to get more sugars produced, which means I got to feed the crop a bit, and we can activate this soil and it rapidly changes. Now, one thing I'll point out here, because I mentioned before, the lime, oftentimes we tend to over-apply lime on low pH soils. Looking at it from a pH adjustment, this soil is light enough. It only has a CEC of around, it ranges from 7 to 10. And you'll notice on the calcium, if you could read it, the base saturation numbers are actually quite low. On this particular soil, they're only looking for desired value of 1,300 to 1,500 pounds of calcium per acre. So what that's telling me is that a ton of lime goes a long ways in this situation to correct that pH. If I went out there and threw on 3 ton, I'd be totally wasting my money. I'd get that 1 year buying out of the carbonate portion, but the pH would be, pH is not just a lime perspective. Calcium changes pH, magnesium changes pH, potassium changes pH, and then you've got your whole biological spectrum that adjusts the various nutrients, and it all factors into your pH number. So just be cautious about liming applications. It actually takes a really heavy soil to justify more than a ton of lime in one application. Anything with a CEC of under about 15 should never have more than a ton per application. Otherwise, you're wasting money. So in this case, pretty much all of our micronutrients are running low, but I know that there's going to be a lot of micronutrients in this, not only in the base soil, this was a glaciated area, but in all this organic matter, there's going to be micronutrients tied up in that section that can be made crop available if we get our life going. So I don't think this would be an economical situation to go out and just put on a lot of dry nutrients without activating the soil biology first. Now this one's probably even harder to read. It's a Dairy 1 forage analysis. First crop taking off the field, we were looking at the soil analysis before. Kind of the same situation, really low nutrients across the board here. This was a sorghum Sudan crop that I put out, and me being in the soils business, crop consulting business, you ever heard the story about the doctor's wives being the sickest in town and cobbler's children going barefoot? Well, some of my farming happens that way too. I don't get things done when I want to get done. So this crop got planted, and that's basically all that happened to it. I planted it. I didn't get out to do any foliar feeding. I was taking care of other fields elsewhere, and this just grew up, and we harvested it, got what we had. So I doubt I made a lot of progress. This crop it was a sorghum Sudan, but it was relatively low nutrients across the board, relatively low sugar. Probably didn't do the soil a whole lot of good. But what I was going to point out here, one of the things you can take home is looking at nutrient balance. The first thing you do with a forage test is divide the protein by 6.25. And that gives us a nitrogen number, in this case, of 1.56, which is pretty low. You want to see nitrogen in a forage crop like this somewhere between 2.5 and 3 is better. And that translates to a protein level of 18, somewhere between 17 and 20%. Now, if you know anything about labs and protein numbers, that's exactly what they're doing at the lab. They're actually doing a nitrogen test multiplying that by 6.25. So if you want your nitrogen number, just take your protein and divide it by that. We want to see a phosphorus level on a forage test of somewhere between 0.5 and 0.75. It's really common to see phosphorus run low in a soil test, in a forage test. Phosphorus on this forage test, the dry matter basis, was only 0.13, really low. Now, comparatively speaking, the micronutrients here on this test are good, and that would, although they were low in the soil, that lower pH, the micronutrients tend to be in a reduced form and more available than they are at higher pHs. So although they're not in excellent level, the micronutrients here are better than they otherwise could be. Potassium is one that often runs too high in forage tests, particularly on dairy farms where there's a lot of manure application. Ideally, you'd want to see potassium to be about halfway between the calcium and nitrogen. Under 3 is good, between 2.5 and 3 is good in a forage. Where you have excessive potassium, you run into a high potassium forage. That automatically means it's going to be a low calcium forage. And that's really what causes the problem when you feed too much potassium in the diet. It's not the excessive potassium that directly causes the problem, it's the excessive potassium keeps the calcium out. And that's where you run into your problems with low calcium. So calcium is something in a forage crop, I don't think we can get it too high. It's the higher the better. I've never seen where I thought excessive calcium was hurting anything. On this particular sample, low pH soil, low calcium availability, we've only got a 0.55 calcium number. That should be, in a grass crop, should be at least 1. In a legume crop should be over 1.5, ideally headed towards 2. If you could get a 1-to-1 ratio of calcium and potassium, that would be a really great forage from that perspective. Now I'll give you a key to moderating the potassium levels in a crop, getting more calcium to come up. Pay attention to the manganese levels. I mentioned manganese as being one of the photosynthesis, one of the nutrients that photosynthesis is dependent on. Manganese is also a potassium regulator. If you have generous levels of manganese in a forage, you're likely to have either enough potassium if you're low in it, or you can reduce the levels if you're too high in it. It works both directions. Sulfur is another really important one, and this is one you can look at even if you're purchasing feed, like buying in some Western hay or something. If you don't have a sulfur nitrogen ratio of 10-to-1 or lower, 1 unit of sulfur for 10 units of nitrogen or less, 1-to-6 would probably be ideal. But anything more than 1-to-10, don't buy the feed. It's being sold for, if you're buying it on protein basis and it doesn't have enough sulfur, what you're buying is free nitrogen. It's not going to give your cows ruminate good. The very minimum you can get by with a healthy forage is 10-to-1. And it's better if it's even lower. In this case, this particular forage, we've got a sulfur number of 0.17. The nitrogen here was 1.56, so I'm just over the threshold. That part's okay. Both of those numbers need to be considerably higher, but the ratio's okay. I wouldn't want to see it much lower than that, but the ratio's there. The magnesium is another one that we often see low in a forage. It probably, along with manganese, is probably the #1 limiting nutrient that I see across forages. Magnesium is directly related to chlorophyll production. It's probably more likely to be limiting factor in your forage production than what nitrogen is on most farms. Based on all the forage samples I've seen, magnesium is often the limiting factor than nitrogen is. And nitrogen will give you a green up response, maybe even a production response, but it won't give you a healthy forage response the way magnesium will. Here's one way to tell whether, it's an easy way to tell in the field whether you're low in magnesium in relation to nitrogen. Both of them will give you a dark green color in a crop. But if you squeeze out the sap, and the sap is lighter in color than the leaf surface, that's an indication you're probably low in magnesium and have excessive levels of nitrogen. The magnesium shows up in the sap, whereas nitrogen just shows up in the leaf surface. And then the trace elements, the iron, copper, boron, manganese, zinc, molybdenum, that's all. Most of these traces are relatively inexpensive to apply. Here's where forage testing, plant testing is really important, because the metallic elements, your iron, your copper, your manganese, zinc's an outlier because zinc does not have multiple oxidation states. Zinc's what they use for preventing rust on roof metal, and your zinc plated metal typically does not rust. But all your other metals will oxidize and rust. Soil tests will pick up some of the oxidated materials, but they're not plant available. All these metallic elements have to be in reduced form to be plant available. So that's why I really like plant testing on top of soil testing, to give me a lot better idea of what the plant needs and what's out there. Biology will reduce elements. Going back to what I was describing, the bacteria feeding on the sugars, mining out nutrition from the soil. But it's important to understand that mining is not a negative thing in terms of, we're pulling this out of the soil and it's leaving the farm. A little of that takes place, but a lot of the mining is actually elements that may be showing up on your soil test, are there, but they're not in plant available form until the biology makes them so.